Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bounds. The Face magazine burst onto newsstands in 1980, created by British publisher Nick Logan after he'd spearheaded the New Musical Express, yes, we call it the NME too, and launching smash hits. With The Face, however, Logan created something truly unique. At the heart of the magazine was its innovative approach to photography and a deeply held respect for those working behind the camera, photographers and stylists alike. Well, a new exhibition at London's National Portrait Gallery celebrates the photography and legacy of The Face and how it not only reflected but helped create culture from its very first issue until the early 2000s. The exhibition is a who's who of contemporary cool and an ode to the power of print media. On today's show, we'll hear from the curator of that exhibition, and it's one we heartily recommend a visit to, as well as a former editor of The Face and Monocle's own editor-in-chief. But first, Sabina Jaskot-Gill is the curator of The Face Culture Shift at the National Portrait Gallery. Just as the museum's team were putting the finishing touches to the show, checking the levels of Neneh Cherry's Buffalo stance ready to blare out at visitors, and straightening photos of Madonna and Run DMC, I sat down with Sabina to find out more about how they put it all together.
Who's looking good today? Who's looking good in every way? No stop.
Sabina, congratulations on a beautiful show. We feel very honoured to breathe the rarefied air of the hours before the private view. It's a real amazing explosion and celebration of a fantastic magazine and so many fantastic eras. I know that you co-curated this with Lee and Norbert, two of the people that put The Face together over the years. And I wondered, first of all, what were some of the words and moods that you were trying to capture in this show, which is such a cacophony, I suppose.
Cacophony, I love it. Well, do you know what? So we started curating this show back in 2018, so it's a long process. Uh-huh. And I think what was really important for us was to be really led by the photography and to really think about how the magazine was changing the language of portrait and fashion photography across those decades. You know, I think for any magazine to change that language on one occasion is pretty rare, but what The Face did was do that on multiple occasions. Mm-hmm. So we really wanted to make sure that we were giving that space to each of those different moments within the magazine and representing that adequately. I mean, iconic is a word that keeps getting bandied around a lot.
Okay.
But I think actually probably maybe the words were the most difficult words to pin down were the title, because we deliberated a lot about what to call this show. And we settled on Culture Shift because actually it kind of brought together a lot of the ideas that we did want to bring together, which is how, you know, this magazine was trailblazing in so many ways and really shaping the culture across the 2.5 decades when it was running from 1980 to 2004. You know, in terms of the music that we listened to, in terms of the clubs that we went to, in terms of the clothes that we were wearing, but also, you know, the people in the portraits. You know, that it kind of made some of these models the most famous faces of their time, and it did change photography. So we thought that Culture Shift was quite a good way to articulate that.
Yeah, it sums it up perfectly. And now you are your senior curator here of photography. It's the Portrait Gallery. It's a very happy circumstance then that you're dealing with some of these amazing images from The Face. I wonder what you lent into as a curator, because obviously it's a show about a magazine that has its own layout, it has its own logic and rubric. What kind of language are you using? Are you using magazine language with the show, or exhibition language, or a happy crash of the two?
Well, not just any magazine language, but some of the most iconic, back to that word again, design language of any magazine, really. You know, I think what we've tried to show throughout the exhibition is how each successive art director has tried to kind of do something a little bit different to its predecessors. You know, you start with someone like Neville Brody, who's kind of doing something quite radical and trailblazing. And, you know, each successive art director, Robin Derrick, Phil Bicker, Lee, later Craig Tilford, you know, they're all doing something quite different. And so actually to try and emulate those different styles in some way felt like the wrong thing to do. We didn't want to kind of imitate the brilliance of those. But we have kind of lent into the kind of magazine-y nature of this exhibition. So rather than kind of traditional hang with kind of, you know, lots of minimal objects, like it is a real kind of riot of images, different scales and proportions, and kind of thinking about how, you know, those images would appear in the layouts of the magazines as well.
It's amazing seeing some of these images in some of the rooms, huge as well. I mean, like, they would obviously be A4 or slightly larger back in the day with the magazine, but it's wonderful to see some of these images blown up to wall size, to real hero size. I mean, that must have been great, but there must have been some strong arguments about what got pumped up and what stayed within a vitrine on the pages of the magazine.
Definitely. I mean, actually, it's interesting working on this exhibition because there's no archive of face photography as such. You know, other magazines do. Like,
there's a lot of courtesy of the artist here as an attribution, right? Yeah.
So I say 96-7% of the show has come directly from the photographers. And it's been a real process to actually find a lot of the images that we wanted. A lot of the images were lost. I think there's some kind of stash of amazing images at some repro house somewhere that we haven't managed to find. So it's been a big process of finding the images. You know, people have really kind of hunted through archives to find some of these things. And we haven't been able to find everything. So some of the design decisions have been led by that, really. So, you know, things like we've got an amazing big wallpaper from a shoot called Alex Works, where there's a girl kind of flipping through copies of the magazine, and it's sort of wall size, it's ginormous. But that there was no original file for that. We couldn't find one, so we had to scan from the magazine page and retouch.
That's got a lovely quality to it in itself, though.
So some of it has been some of those decisions have been kind of led by the material, really, because we couldn't get everything. It becomes a bit easier in the 90s. People became a bit better at kind of archiving
People knew it might
their
be
work.
Worth something.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think in terms of imagery and kind of sizes, it was a real process between myself and Leon Norbert thinking about which image we thought would stand up, which represented really key moments for the magazine. But sometimes there's some really lovely kind of tiny treasures, like the Sinead O'Connor portrait by Jürgen Teller is tiny. It's almost the size that it would have been produced as a Polaroid. And so there are kind of real shifts in scale, but it makes it a quite nicely kind of paced exhibition, I think.
Yeah, because you are leaning in to concentrate on even the captions. As we come from magazine world here with this podcast, so we kind of lean into captions and some of the details of the magazine making as much as seeing these things blown up to kind of wall sizes.
The captions are interesting because rather than having lots of museum speak or kind of, curator written interpretation, the captions are generated from interviews with the photographers, the stylists, art directors, some of the sitters, and they give you a really nice insight into the making of the images, behind the scenes content, but also just reflections on the significance of the magazine, what it meant for them, for their careers, but also what it meant for the culture at large.
Yeah. There's a sense, seeing this stuff, it feels like there's a sense, obviously, of historical inevitability to the existence and success of this great magazine, this great title, right? But obviously in the early days, no one knew if it was going to last 2 issues, 3 issues, back in the day when Nick Logan started it. So it's a funny thing, you're looking down another end of a telescope and looking at what looks like inevitability. Do you see that? I wonder if you can see a kind of growing confidence in the photography, the art direction, and the look and feel of the magazine as it becomes a going concern through the cover images or the layouts and some of the subject matter, maybe.
I think probably the images become more sophisticated and more kind of complex in terms of the teams that are making them. But I would argue that right from the very start, there's a confidence there. The name that Nick chooses for this magazine, The Face, it's this mod term for someone who has like the right clothes, the right style. And it is about that kind of attitude, that confidence. And I think he was looking for images that really captured that. So even in the very early kind of studio portraits like Kim Wilde and Adam Mann, you're getting that kind of confidence. But what's amazing is it's photographers who have, are learning on the job from for many of them. A lot of the early photographers were kind of music photographers who were kind of, used to photographing in the pit at gigs or like, on location. And And they were kind of learning new things. They were having to learn how to set up studio lighting or how to use large format cameras. And none of them really knew what they were doing, and they admit to this. They had to kind of learn as they went along. But it's this kind of like, this experimentation that, continues throughout the magazine, and the freedom to experiment that the editorial team give to the contributors that makes the magazine so unique and makes the images stand out from other magazines on the newsstands.
And there's a sense of, I guess the Face started out documenting culture, and then it came to create culture. Pretty quickly, scenes bubbled up in order almost to be in a magazine like the Face, or rather that magazine specifically. Does that feel like the case to you, that actually people the more stuff happened because there was somewhere for it to go, in a way, in that era, in the mid-'80s?
Right from the second episode, you get Robert Elms writing about, the Blitz Club and that kind of very famous article, The Cult with No Name. And it's a scene that's kind of made to be written about and to be photographed, and the magazine is very quick to kind of to make that scene visible. It wasn't known to a wider public, but by being in those pages it was. And then obviously it kind of, the people who are part of that scene go on to shape the decade in quite significant ways. But throughout its history it is constantly trying to kind of stay one step ahead and to find the next new thing. And I think that's partly because the writers were living those kind of music scenes themselves. Like, they were all out at the clubs, and they were going to the festivals, and they were living it, and so they could write about it with, again, that confidence and that authority, and kind of share it. It was about sharing it with that, the wider public. And I think there's a really lovely quote in the exhibition where it says, I think it's from Greg Fay, but I'd have to double check it, where it says, the magazine was really great. It made you feel like you were being let in on a secret, even though it wasn't just you, it was everyone who was finding out about it. But it had that quality.
Growing up, buying it and growing up in the countryside, it made you feel like you were invited into these places that maybe if you could summon up the confidence on a weekend to get the train up to London and go to one of these places. But it felt like the doors it felt like it was an invitation to a lot of people.
Did you go to the places? Did you get on the train?
Of course I did. That's why I look like this. We didn't have time to talk about any of the great writing here, and as you sort of suggested with your last answer, actually some of the kind of issue stories that are in the Face as well. But people just have to come and see for themselves. The hang continues around us. We'd better let you get on with it. Sabina, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
That was Sabina Jaskot-Gill. Now, back at Midori House, I was delighted to be joined in the studio by Johnny Davis, editor of The Face between 1999 and 2002, and Monocle's very own editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, and a Face fan too, to try to unravel why The Face had such cultural cachet and its legacy on the world of magazines.
Thanks for having us.
It's really lovely to have you both here.
Thank you, Rob.
And also thank you for going into your garage and dusting off dusting the mouse droppings off some issues of The Face. They're arrayed in front of us. So, a question to both of you. Andrew, you first of all. When we talk about The Face, what atmosphere, what front covers, what vibe does it say to you? What's the atmos that you dig into?
Well, Rob, I think before we came on, we both agreed we were probably... Neither felt quite cool enough, really, to be a Face person, or certainly not a Face employee. But we both purchased the magazine, and so it comes out when I was 18 years old, and so in my 20s, they were just covers that you saw, that you felt compelled to buy, and that's why still in my garage I have all these magazines, all sorts of magazines, but I certainly have all the Faces that I bought when I was in my 20s, and I think it was it always seemed a little bit removed from me. It was a bit cooler than I was, but there were clubs that I went to, and now looking back at that time, it's so distinctive. And what's so amazing is when I went to see the exhibition is that the number of those front covers that you just remember now. And I can't. Why is it that that Kate Moss cover so in your mind so electrically? it's amazing. They were compelling covers, and they did define an era. And that's, as we'll talk about the exhibition, that's what's so amazing about the show.
And Johnny, for you, what sort of burnt into your retina? I mean, you edited this magazine, but what about in the early days as a writer and as a young man about town? What sort of struck you between the eyeballs? With the face?
Similarly, I think with the covers in that I grew up in Bristol, but it sort of doesn't really matter where I grew up because people have a similar relationship with the face and the face covers in that they were always so different in that it was a fashion, music and style magazine ostensibly. But I mean, you didn't really know what was going to be on the cover from month to month. And I genuinely remember kind of working out when it was going to come out, which sort of week of the month it was going to come out, and sort of going around the museums in Bristol trying to find it. And you'd be as surprised by some Hollywood superstar as you would by some indie pop star or a cannabis leaf or a model or something. And they all had high impact and they were all kind of amazing. But you sort of thought, that's the world I want to get involved with. And it became a sort of a telegraph from some kind of unknown cool place.
Yeah.
That was called London. And loads of people have this relationship. People who work for it, the writers and the stylists and everyone had the same thing. It was like a sort of calling card because it was pre-internet, it was pre-everything. If you aspired to look at cool stuff, you had the sort of NME, and then you had sort of a turbocharged colour version of it, which was the face.
Yeah. And in terms, I mean, how decipherable was it in your eyes as a magazine? Because before we switched on the microphones, Andrew and I were having a natter upstairs, and I was sort of saying, and I don't want to speak for you, Andrew, but I was certainly sort of saying my entry into magazines was things like the Sunday Times. It was the supplements of the papers your parents bought, kind of thing. So there was very much a kind of a linear, gridish kind of rubric to these things. Johnny, what about the face? Because it was splashy design, it was punchy design. What about the look and feel of that thing, and how decipherable was it for you as a young reader?
I think it was, because I think it was the thing that all great magazines have, is that there are people. It's easy to forget that they're a combination of words and pictures, right? So, quite rightly, the exhibition is about photography because it was amazing, but it also had really amazing journalism in it. It had writers like Chris Heath and Miranda Sawyer and Sylvia Patterson, and that some of them actually came from pop magazines, Smash Hits and NME, which Nick Logan, the founder of The Face, worked on beforehand, founded Smash Hits beforehand. But yeah, it's that combination of, so you could be dazzled by the visuals, and maybe they're a bit outre if it was the fashion. That was certainly not. I wasn't buying it for the fashion, but similarly, you could have like a 4,000 or 5,000 word feature on whichever Hollywood star or whichever Britpop band were around at the time, and that was part of the appeal for me, for sure.
Well, the interesting thing is because Neville Brody was doing the typography in the early days, that there was another player between the pictures and the words, and so the layouts. I think what Rob is hinting at is that sometimes
where's the bit I read?
Sometimes the design of the page, it was challenging on that front as well.
Yeah, I guess so, and I guess that's what made it stand out, right? And also Nick Logan's thing was he never wanted it to be a sort of a niche thing. He wanted to compete with the rest of the magazines on the newsstand. ID is one that gets referenced with The Face as well, which launched, I think, 9 months after The Face launched. And that had quite a small print run. That was meant to be a niche kind of club culture title, and it's very, very good idea. It's hugely successful. But that wasn't his idea with it. He wanted it to compete with other glossy magazines. Why should Vogue have all the fun? We can be as impactful visually as those big titles as well.
Did it? I mean, a lot of people reference The Face and sort of talk about the fact that it had a bit of a homemade vibe. I know Nick Logan, I think, supposedly, possibly apocryphally, him and his wife's life savings went into it, and he had a sort of damp basement in Covent Garden. And, obviously this was in the days of typesetting and laying things out with, pens and rulers and scissors and things, making this magazine. If it's fair to say that it had a homemade nature, Andrew, does that bear itself out in some of the way the story list and the look and feel of some of these early mags?
Well, there's a few things there. I think you have to remember that all magazines were pretty much homemade then. I was at magazine Time Out where you ran out galleys on paper that was then put through a wax machine and cut and spliced and made onto layouts. And if there was a typo at the last minute, someone had to cut it out with a scalpel. It was a homemade profession in many ways. But what's also interesting, and I think which comes across, especially in the fashion elements you see in this exhibition, is that there was a lot of make do and mend. You look at the early pictures of Boy George or many of the early
sort of Blitz Club stuff.
Yeah, all that. People were putting their clothes together in a really interesting way. Even the stylists were a bit homemade in the way they did things, in a really glorious way. And Johnny mentioned something there which I think also comes across in the exhibition is you do wonder, that in this age where, we come into the office and you ask people what they did the weekend, and I made a Sunday roast and I went for a 10k run. People were out in clubs. People were out in clubs.
A tankery run.
and there's Kate, the former fashion editor. There's a great quote on the wall. She said, half of the good ideas in the magazine came from meeting on a dance floor, meeting in a club bar. They didn't all happen in the editorial room.
Yeah.
And that clubby, that put together feel, it came on page as well.
Yeah, look, what about that, Johnny? Because it did definitely feel like that, as Andrew says, that's a wall text, and it's a sort of defining mission of the exhibition to kind of pour people into a nightclub at 11 p.m. and pull them out at 4 or whatever it is. What about that? I mean, that idea of club culture runs like the writing through a stick of rock in this exhibition and indeed in the magazine. Right?
It does, and I'd kind of forgotten a bit about that, and I was surprised at how well that does come across in the exhibition, because there's a whole room of just has the kind of the spreads of the people out clubbing and the lineage of it all, and I guess it was reporting on stuff that I don't know if it was the only place you could get that, but it was certainly a place that treated it with the kind of seriousness and the photography that it kind of deserved. But yeah, there's definitely always a going out culture at the Face from the clubs in the 80s to when I was there, and the clubs in the 90s. But also, like, I think all the best magazines, from you can include Smash Hits and you can include Monocle in that, they have their own culture, right? There's something that's right for Smash Hits and it's right for Monocle. You have these conversations, and that's what makes it good. And it's a club you can join as a reader, or you think, no thanks, I'll have Reader's Digest instead or something.
But that capturing that going out spirit is easier sort of said than done, actually. You need to really be in it. You need photographers that are patient. It was not look at these weird people at a rave under a flyover on the M4. It was people were right in it up to their necks.
I think it's this thing, that not everybody had a camera phone, of course. So, that you sent out great photographers to cover clubs. When I was at Time Out, there was a guy called Dave Swindales. He went out, I think, 3-4 nights a week just photographing people for his pages. It was a whole kind of culture. There's a really wonderful fashion shoot as well that's shown, where the photographer got clothes off of the big brands, gave them to these kids who are like crowd surfing, and this combination, the fashion again came to the club and took over the kids, and you see these sweaty kids. But also, I love that, which I hadn't quite realised how skillfully the Face had done it, because it's very easy for a magazine to get caught up with one musical movement. But they switched every 4 or 5 years, however music changed. It was the magazine for two-tone, and then it was the magazine for rave culture.
Yeah, because Jerry Dammers, wasn't it? I mean, the Specials was issue 2, was it cover?
I think it's issue 1.
Was it issue 1,
yeah.
was it? Yeah. And I think Dylan Jones talks about that in, maybe it's the book or maybe it's the exhibition, but there's such a lot. And also, we've mentioned, Dylan, we've mentioned, you've got, we were talking a few weeks ago, Andrew, about some of your friends. And obviously we're sitting here with Johnny. It was a great talent pool for photographers, stylists, writers, people that would go on to edit that magazine and others as well. What are some of the names to conjure with?
Johnny Davis. Johnny Davis.
Oh, he's in the room. Hello, Johnny Davis.
Johnny came when I was at the Independent newspaper running the magazines. Johnny became one of our key writers. Adam Higginbotham, the editor before Johnny, became one of our key writers. Kate Flett, who you were mentioning there, she's still a very successful writer, and I met up with her at Christmas through various circumstances when we were away. There's quite a few.
Through various circumstances means that he was out. That was drag me out of the club at 4 a.m.
We were in Spain. That was a coincidence. But anyway, those people have done well, but of course it was a calling card for photographers and for art directors, and maybe the likes of Robin Derrick and these people. They perhaps got more of a kind of a star billing afterwards. Many of the photographers.
Robin went off to be the art director at Vogue.
Yeah, so again, it's interesting how many people, when you look at the masthead, they left this scrappy magazine in some senses, but they ended up working for Condé Nast. There was quite a pull to Condé Nast.
And there obviously it was a magazine that did music, did style, did fashion, clubbing, all the rest of it, but it also covered social issues in a really. You mentioned Miranda Sawyer; she did some wonderful work in that line. It talked about Clause 4. It talked about child soldiers in Somalia. It talked about drugs as the flip side of the clubbing culture and the rest of it. How easily did these sit in the editorial mix, Johnny? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's one thing, kind of, you turn the page from a rave and you're talking about possibly the dark side of that. How happily did these sort of editorial bedfellows nestle down together?
Yeah, I think it really did, because we were kind of interested in all that stuff as well. The one that comes to mind as you're speaking is we did we followed a group of they were crop protesters. So they were going and disrupting genetically modified crops, whatever. And we did it with sort of kind of face style photography and stuff. And we gave them a platform to talk seriously in a proper amount of pages and coverage. There was a great writer called Gavin Hills who did a lot of the kind of war reporting. Went to Sarajevo and various other places for the Face in the mid-90s and stuff. And yeah, it just seemed to be. It just was a natural part of what it did. It did, it took culture and the broader world seriously, but it brought it within its world.
Yeah. And also you'd have musicians, you talk about the specials and the kind of culture that came with a band like that and what they stood for. And it was a place, it seemed to be a forum where people could talk seriously about some of the issues or some of the lyrics of their music without being laughed out of town or without having, you know what I mean? There weren't that many top tens. It's like, oh, why you're here?
Yes, no, it was
what do you have for breakfast?
No, it's none of that. And also, and also we talked about being pre-internet. There was also a really an obvious kind of. It benefited from the fact there was a what do you call it, like a stepping stone thing. So the enemy might discover a band or write about a band, and then eventually they would get into the Sunday Times. But in the middle, they would have this bit in the Face where the Face would do a cover with them, and they'd be photographed by some amazing international photographer. And of course, they loved that because that sort of legitimizes them. It put them into a different context, a different audience, that's when it got to the sort of the 2000s, that sort of disappeared because everyone was chasing the same stuff. But for a great, glorious point, it was the place where you could photograph people in colour and talk to them seriously and give them the sort of space that you thought that they deserved.
But the other thing that struck me when I looked at that is like lots of things that people talk about being modern now or they're doing to magazines. We're talking like 45 years ago almost. And, it's shocking. 45 years ago.
I am joined by two beautifully well-preserved gentlemen.
I think Johnny he came later, but I'm certainly of that time. But, playfulness around gender, commissioning female photographers to shoot women, having people of every race on page as beauty, challenging stereotypes, and there's no effort in it. That's the other fun thing. It's not even really knowing about it. It's just we tend to look back at the past and think it was a bit kind of dull, and it didn't embrace change and optimism and newness. But in fact, when you look at the Face, I came out of that thinking, God, actually. What some of the people are banging on about what they're doing now? They should just come and see this because it was all done 45 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, like the best places, no one was really telling. I don't really know where that came from because no one was telling us what to do. It certainly wasn't. You didn't have to go and present it to the publisher or the board or whatever. You thought that seems right for us.
That was Johnny Davis and Monocle's Andrew Tuck. And the Face magazine, Culture Shift, is open at London's National Portrait Gallery until the 18th of May. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. Many thanks to Alan Whedon for editing help with today's episode. We'll all be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bound, thanks for tuning in.